What happens when the very concept of maritime deterrence becomes a relic of the past? For 45 years, the Strait of Hormuz was a line in the sand that no one dared to cross without a calculated risk. On February 28, 2026, that calculation changed forever as the Iranian military machine vanished in less than 12 hours. This was the clinical execution of a strategic equation that had been decades in the making by the world's most powerful forces. Before we deconstruct how the United States dismantled a regional power sovereignty in a single afternoon, you need to join the inner circle. Hit the subscribe button and share this with one person who needs to see the world. Joining Navy means you're choosing to see the world through the lens of hard military reality. Let us look at the moment the rules of engagement were fundamentally and violently rewritten for the 21st century. To understand the violence of February 2026, we must look back to September 5th, 2025. This was the day the United States officially signaled a return to a total wartime footing by renaming the Department of Defense. Under the direction of President Donald Trump and Secretary Pete Hegseth, it became the Department of War once again. This was a psychological pivot that prioritized decisive lethality over the endless diplomatic stalemates that had defined the previous 4 decades. For months, the rebranded War Department coordinated a massive logistical buildup that the mainstream media largely dismissed. They were wrong to ignore the movement of thousands of precision-guided munitions into the theater of operations. The administration was preparing for Operation Epic Fury, a campaign designed to do more than just send a message. The goal was the systematic erasure of the Islamic Republic's ability to project force beyond its own borders. On the morning of February 28th, the sky over Iran was filled with the kinetic energy of 900 precision strikes. In just 12 hours, the landscape of Middle Eastern geopolitics was permanently altered by a storm of fire. These strikes were not random acts of aggression, but a mathematical removal of specific Iranian capabilities. Ballistic missile silos, air defense networks, and command hubs were targeted with a surgical and terrifying intensity across the entire nation. U.S. and Israeli forces worked in a seamless synchronization that overwhelmed Iranian radars within the first minutes of the assault. The deterrence promise of the regime, the idea that they could protect their airspace, was shattered in a morning. By the end of that first day, the Iranian air power had been functionally neutered by the volume of incoming fire. Their sortie rate, which usually ranged from 30 to 100 combat flights, was driven down to 0. This was the opening move of a campaign that would eventually hit over 11,000 targets in a single month of operations. The scale of the destruction was so vast that it redefined what a modern conventional war looks like. We are talking about the destruction of 85% of Iran's entire defense industrial base in just 38 days. The factories meant to rebuild their arsenal were turned to rubble before the first week of conflict was over. The speed of the collapse was a symptom of a larger strategic failure that the regime had ignored for years. Iran had spent decades building underground missile cities, believing these hardened assets made them completely untouchable by Western powers. But Navy has analyzed the technical data. Operation Epic Fury proved that static defenses are no match for modern kinetic dominance. The regime found itself in a situation where their most prized military assets were becoming strategic liabilities. As the smoke cleared from the initial 900 strikes, a new and more dangerous reality began to set in for the global economy. The Iranian leadership, realizing their conventional forces were failing, reached for their final lever of power. They looked toward the narrowest point of the Persian Gulf, a tiny strip of water with global significance. The 34-kilometer-wide corridor known as the Strait of Hormuz was about to become a global economic battlefield. On March 2nd, the IRGC declared the strait closed, an act that sent shockwaves through every financial capital on Earth. This move was a desperate attempt to hold the global economy hostage in exchange for a ceasefire. They began deploying naval mines throughout the corridor, creating a physical obstruction to the world's most vital energy artery. It was a move that sent Brent crude prices skyrocketing to $100 a barrel. Traffic through the strait, which usually sees 18 million barrels of oil daily, dropped by over 90% within days. The world was suddenly facing a shortage that threatened to paralyze industrial nations and trigger a global economic collapse. On March 2nd, 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps realized their conventional deterrence was mathematically erased by Epic Fury. With their missile silos smoking ruins, Tehran played their final, most desperate card, the closure of the Hormuz Strait. They didn't just issue a verbal threat, they began seeding the 34-kilometer-wide corridor with sophisticated, stealthy naval mines. This was no longer a regional skirmish. It was a direct assault on the artery, pumping 18 million barrels daily. The response from the newly renamed Department of War was not diplomatic. It was a systematic execution of supremacy. President Donald Trump and Secretary Pete Hegseth unleashed a maritime purge that the world had never witnessed in modern naval history. Within a matter of weeks, the Iranian Navy ceased to exist as a functioning, cohesive, or credible military entity. 150 warships, representing 16 different vessel classes, were hunted down and sent to the ocean floor. Every single operational submarine in the Iranian inventory was located by sonar and neutralized before they could even submerge. The Strait of Hormuz, once a symbol of Iranian leverage, became a graveyard of twisted steel and burning fuel. CJCS General Dan Kane described the complexity of these operations with a hauntingly simple and very direct analogy. He called it the parking lot doctrine, comparing maneuvers in the congested Gulf to driving a sports car through supermarkets. This wasn't just combat. It was a cold, calculated display of precision that turned a choke point into American territory. While this technical breakdown of naval power might seem distant, the reality is felt at every gas pump on Earth. I want to pause here for a second, because this specific moment changed the rules of maritime law forever. If you are beginning to understand how quickly a global superpower can dismantle decades of buildups, I need a favor. Type the word Hormuz in the comments now. It takes 2 seconds, but it tells the system you are tracking. By the 38-day mark, the quantitative data revealed a nation stripped of its ability to project a shadow of force. Iran's defense industrial base, the very foundation of their military-industrial complex, was now 85% destroyed or totally inoperable. Air power, which previously sustained 30 to 100 daily combat sorties, was reduced to a definitive zero. Nothing was flying. Nothing was sailing. The calculated mathematical erasure was proceeding exactly as the Department of War had modeled. Over 11,000 targets were neutralized in that first month, creating a vacuum where a regional power once stood. The U.S. Navy achieved this level of total dominance using only 10% of its available global naval power. This statistic should terrify every other global actor currently watching these events unfold from the safety of the sidelines. A fraction of the American fleet had turned a heavily fortified coastline into a series of disconnected, burning islands. The blockade was no longer just about stopping weapons. It evolved into a total, crushing strangulation of the state. The U.S. Navy began intercepting raw materials like iron, steel, and aluminum, ensuring the regime could not even rebuild. This was the implementation of a strategy designed to turn the lights out on a nation's military ambitions forever. As the smoke cleared from the initial naval engagements, the world watched a once impenetrable fortress become a transparent shell. The deterrence promise that the Iranian regime had fed its people for 45 years lay at the bottom. Every ship lost was more than just a hull. It was a mathematical variable removed from the regional equation. The Islamabad negotiations, meant to be a bridge to peace, were actually the calm before an even more violent storm. As Vice President J.D. Vance monitored the data, it became clear that the diplomatic path was a dead end. The military reality on the ground had moved faster than the politicians in Pakistan could possibly process or handle. The transition from active combat to total naval blockade marked the beginning of a new, agonizing phase for Tehran. Intelligence suggested that while the physical silos were gone, the knowledge base for their nuclear ambitions remained a threat. This meant the blockade could not be a temporary measure. It had to be a permanent fixture of order. Brent crude had already surpassed $100 a barrel, and global markets realized the old world was gone. The IEA issued a chilling warning that Europe was down to its final 6 weeks of jet fuel reserves. Every minute the strait remained closed, the economic pressure on the regime grew by hundreds of thousands of dollars. The physical destruction of the Iranian fleet was merely the prelude to a much deeper, more systemic collapse. As of June 2026, the Iranian economy is hemorrhaging $435 million daily today. This is not just a financial dip. It is a total collapse of a nation's ability to exist. Domestic inflation has rocketed past 100%, turning basic survival into an impossibility. The deterrence promise that the regime spent 40 years building has been systematically dismantled by the U.S. Navy. What remains is a nation struggling to breathe under the weight of a total naval blockade. For a very brief moment, it appeared the world might find an exit ramp from this global fire. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif brokered a 2-week ceasefire in Islamabad on April 8, 2026. But in the high-stakes chess game of modern warfare, a pause is often just a preparation for a move. The ceasefire didn't even survive the first night. Israel launched Operation Eternal Darkness, a name signaling total ruin. In a staggering display of precision, they executed 100 airstrikes in just 10 minutes across southern Lebanon. The city of Beirut saw 92 dead as the night sky turned into a wall of flame. This was the final nail in the coffin for any hope of a lasting diplomatic solution. By April 12th, Vice President J.D. Vance officially confirmed what the world already suspected. The Islamabad negotiations had failed, and the era of total enforcement had now officially begun. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, operating under the newly renamed Department of War, has turned the Gulf into a secure zone. They are maintaining this stranglehold using only 10% of their available naval power. General Dan Kane calls it the parking lot doctrine, a cold mathematical reality of sea control. It is the tactical management of a congested waterway, as if it were a high-security private facility for all tankers. The blockade has now expanded beyond just oil and military hardware to include industrial materials. The U.S. is now intercepting raw materials like iron, steel, and aluminum that are essential for any future reconstruction. The message from Washington is clear. There will be no rebuilding until this strategic calculus changes. This is a war of attrition where the tools of victory are economic as much as they are kinetic. While Europe panics over having only 6 weeks of jet fuel remaining, other global powers are watching. Beijing is particularly unsettled by this new precedent of unilateral American control over the world's vital energy lifelines. China views this blockade as a terrifying blueprint for how the U.S. could one day sever their own veins. To them, this isn't just about Iran, it's about who owns the flow of global commerce. The geography of the Strait of Hormuz is permanent, but the power governing it has shifted. We are witnessing the birth of a post-deterrence world where the old rules of the game are completely dead. The U.S. is no longer asking for freedom of navigation through diplomatic channels or international treaties. They are enforcing it through unilateral, overwhelming strength that the world hasn't seen in over 3 decades. This tectonic shift leaves us with a haunting question that every world leader must now answer. Can global energy security ever truly exist without a single empire standing guard over the world's most vital choke points? Is the price of peace simply the acceptance of a global hegemon? Or are we headed for a world of walls? These are the questions the mainstream media refuses to ask as they distract you. If you want to understand the new rules of global power before the crisis hits your doorstep, join us. You need to be part of a community that looks at the math behind the movements. Hit the subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an update. Share this video with one person who still thinks the old world order is coming back soon. Leave a comment below with the word blockade if you believe this is the only way to prevent conflict. Your engagement helps our channel push past the algorithm and tell the stories that actually matter today. This is Navy. We don't just report the headlines, we analyze the equations that move the world. Stay tuned for our next deep dive into the very shadow wars that are shaping your future right now in this dangerous age.